anything that was negative really to Boris Johnson, you take a note of it, put it on the slide deck, and then send that on. The way that we were working, it would be impossible not to also pick up British citizens. I know that some of the more lusty members of the team would go onto their personal profile, look into the person, and see what their history was about.
For the first time, an insider from the Army's controversial information warfare unit, the 77th Brigade, has spoken out, giving an exclusive interview to Big Brother Watch, lifting the lid on how social media was monitored during the pandemic. At the time, military leaders promised us that the 77th Brigade was not being deployed against the British people. But in this exclusive interview, the former soldier tells us how British people's social media posts were collated and passed to the Cabinet Office by the PSYOPs unit as part of sentiment analysis about the government. 77th Brigade works with a Rapid Response Unit, one of the anti-misinformation units sitting at the heart of government. We've been investigating them for months, and our report exposes how political surveillance masqueraded as anti-disinformation work. Welcome to the 21st century Ministry of Truth. Could you tell us a bit about what the 77th Brigade is and a bit kind of about, as much as you can, about what you did with it?
The 77th Brigade is a relatively new unit, and it's formed within a number of different organisations that existed before but were subordinated under a different hierarchy. One of the subunits, if you like, is the outreach group, and they're focused mostly on working with other nations and building capacity and that sort of thing. Literally outreach to foreign countries, developing countries. That was something that I was more allied to before it subordinated under the 77th Brigade. But then also within the 77th Brigade, there's a unit which is more focused on the information operations. And that's the unit that I was seconded to at the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. As it turns out, the commander of the 77th Brigade at the time was very keen to make sure that he could provide manpower towards the COVID-19 response. So as a result, he offered up to the Cabinet Office his unit and sold them a capacity, really, that never really existed under the 77th Brigade before, although it was one that really wanted to get into. So the Cabinet Office were very keen to take him up on that. And so they said, yeah, go ahead. And really there was a kind of general panic where they were looking around for people who could live up to that promise, if you like. And that's where I came in.
And so what capabilities was it that the 77th were pitching into the Cabinet Office?
So my understanding of it is, and I wasn't present at the time, but it's subsequently been told to me that really they were offering up a way of monitoring hostile foreign state misinformation online. So they would look at social media and they would establish sock puppet accounts that were perhaps working for foreign governments with the aim of inspiring panic in the population or essentially doing down the efforts of the government. Very quickly this mutated, and for various reasons, mostly to do with the capability of, it was a very fledgling capability. No one had real expertise on it. It got focused entirely on Twitter because there's no front door. Basically, you can just go onto Twitter to see everyone's tweet. It's not like Facebook where you have to follow somebody and they have to follow you back, however that works. But as a result of that, it became very much a kind of monitoring sentiment to the British public and how they perceived the Conservative administration doing a COVID-19 response.
And sort of this was between the Cabinet Office and the 77th. What was the relationship there? Sort of, I know you said the 77th approached the Cabinet Office, but then in terms of working, who was leading, who was defining what was going to be done?
So I know that when I first arrived at the unit, there was liaison officers and advisors who were all over the government departments. So we had representatives within the Cabinet Office. But the way I'm led to believe it happened was that the commander of the 77th Brigade went directly to the Cabinet Office and offered up the capability. Now, whether that was, your understanding, it's such a hierarchical organisation, whether that was because somebody above him has said that you've got that capability, haven't you, offer it up, or whether he went direct, I don't know. All I know is I was told monitoring foreign misinformation online because we need to go in and operate as part of this team.
So what kind of tools and capabilities were you deploying to monitor this? What you were told was foreign disinformation may have become more domestic surveillance, but what were the tools, what were the capabilities, what were the methods you were using?
So in terms of tools and capabilities, one of the main things is there is a specialist laptop, which is a kind of anonymized laptop that only runs through a kind of like the Onion network. So it doesn't have a physical location, which is broadcastable. It operates at arm's length, and it's quite deniable and anonymized. So we had these specialized laptops that do exist within defense. They're called Opus terminals, which then require a level of training and specialization, which was done in-house. I say it was done in-house. The trainers were external, and they were all from different information units. They were brought into the 77th Brigade to do the training of all of the different teams, of which there were about 5 teams, 3 of whom were remote, and we never used sock puppets for any of our accounts. It was just all logging in as a guest to Twitter and doing like what we would call a sift. So just inputting a search term, whether it be COVID-19, ventilators, Tory lies, whatever. Whatever the search term was, you'd run the search term and you'd look at the top tweets. It was, there was no real training on how to do that. The only training really was around how to run Google searches, look for videos in foreign languages from just through YouTube, for instance, and just going onto YouTube Russia rather than YouTube UK. And it was very much feeling our way because it hadn't been done before, which I suppose in some respects is reassuring, because the last thing I would want to do is feel like I'm participating in quite a common government activity. But yeah, there was very little specialist training.
So you weren't using things like Brandwatch, TweetDeck, sort of more advanced sifting tools?
Initially, TweetDeck was something we were told about and something that we could use. As the task developed, and we found out that really what we were doing was getting passed down from the higher organisation, getting passed down the search terms we were going to use. All they wanted to see was how many times the search term we used accounts that were retweeting the same thing regularly, and really just putting those together onto a PowerPoint presentation and sending them on.
So you said about search terms being used. Can you tell us a bit about the instructions you got, sort of whether from the cabinet office or from your own superiors? What instructions did you receive, and what was the output after kind of your work of the day?
So there would be 2 different ways of doing it. So one thing you would do is, and initially there was no guidance, so it was just find foreign misinformation online. And so we just had to generate our own search terms, and we would just be searching COVID-19, death rate, or whatever. You just type in the search terms, see what came up, and anything that was essentially reflecting poorly on the government, or anything that was negative really to Boris Johnson, the administration, or anyone like that, you'd take a note of it, put it on the slide deck, if you like, and then send that on. So then if the higher authority then saw there was an interesting thread in there that they wanted to pull at, so if there were any hashtags within the snapshot of someone's profiles that they might want to explore, they would then be sent back to the teams. Also, there was stuff that was generated. It may have been generated by the other teams and sent back down to us, but there was stuff that was sent down to us from up above as well. So one of the first things that was sent down to us very early on was ventilators, because that was, do you remember? When it was all about ventilation back in the day. That was handed down to us, and we were expected to look into that and report any incidences.
It was a bit of you identifying things of interest, and some of it came from top down.
That's right.
You mentioned sort of it being about sort of a lot about Conservatives and Boris Johnson. Was there any guidance or kind of official instruction that anything reflects badly on the government should be included, or was it more a wink and a nudge and an informal, like, this is what you should be doing? Yeah,
nothing is. There was no direction, and there was no overt, this is, like, wink, wink, we don't want to know anything about Boris Johnson. It wasn't even that overt, but it very quickly you would, if you sent up something about, Tory lies, then that might come back down to you the next day. And it's like, focus on that. And very quickly you'd have big thematic headings which you're expected to look into, and that very soon, if you were constantly told that's good on a certain line, then you tend to send more of that stuff up because you want to be told that's good rather than you're wasting your time. And it very quickly became apparent that it was more to do with sentiment analysis about the current administration.
So you basically found that they responded very well to when you flagged stuff that was critical of the government of the Conservatives, and that was returned back to you for further investigation.
Right. And when it seemed like the government were doing better in vaccination, or when it seemed like the government were doing better in getting ventilators, they were very keen on seeing what the public response to that was. So all of a sudden it became apparent that Russia or China aren't going to be saying, well done for the respirators. Sorry, for the ventilators. They're going to be doing negatives. So when you're looking for positive messages, you know that you're no longer looking at foreign states' misinformation. You're looking at the public. Yeah,
so this was a big thing when the 77th involvement with the Cabinet Office came out in the Times. The Ministry of Defence said, we are not directing this capability at British citizens. Was that a true statement?
I couldn't say. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what they're thinking or who said it, but from my perspective, I think they could justifiably say that they weren't directing it because they weren't telling us, specifically, we want to know what people think of the government. But when you're getting positive feedback and all you're doing is looking, from my perspective, what I thought I was doing was looking at the British public and reporting back sentiment analysis, then you can kind of direct it without directing it.
So you think a lot of your work was surveying the British public?
On a personal level, very early on, I would always say to the fellow team members, whatever happens during this, you have to act in line with your own conscience. Because if we're doing stuff that is illegal, it's only going to be you that's going to be judged on that. And I mean literally judged, do you know? In a court of law, potentially. So you can't rely on saying that, well, I was directed to. So I was very cautious that I acted in line with my morals. And if I thought what I was doing was really reporting on a scared lady in Solihull who was worried about, justifiably worried, because she'd been worried about the press and government.
And so what safeguards were there to stop you or colleagues who's perhaps less bothered about their conscience surveilling the British public? Were there safeguards in place? Were you told there was a legal line between who you could surveil and who you couldn't? And then how effective were the safeguards?
So we're given training on the legal side of things, and we were told very much what we could do and what we couldn't do when we were looking at people online. So one of the things we were told was you can't really run a developed search on somebody. So you can run a generic sift, along a search term, but so if you can't really click into someone's profile more than, say, you couldn't go back and start looking at all of their tweets, because then that's really, you're targeting them and you're developing it. You then can't the next day search for the person specifically by Twitter handle or by name, because then that is specifically a targeted search. So I don't doubt that we did was legal and right in that respect, but I know that some of the more lusty members of the team who are very keen to see the project succeed would then subsequently, if they were on Twitter, when they went back home that evening, would go onto their personal profile, look into the person and see what their history was about, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And were there any red lines you sort of made clear that this person is so obviously British we can't kind of look at them even in a sift, or was it pretty much fair game in the sift that anyone could be in there and be put on a slide deck and passed on?
Anyone, yeah. And there were times that when I said, but I would just reiterate to people I was on shift with, where I would say to them, are we all sure that what we're doing is, or maybe I would say, I think what you need to do is make sure from your perspective that we aren't just reporting on, that scared person in Solihull rather than misinformation. And there wasn't really any. Later, as the task developed, we got a couple of people who came onto the team because the team was constantly changing, because it was quite intense and quite long shifts. We've got people who actually thought, do you know what? there's probably a better way of finding foreign misinformation online rather than doing these sifts, which seem to throw up, scared people. And there were times when I saw people putting people onto slideshows, and it was like, that profile was maybe Labour Chick 03, hashtag fuck Boris Johnson or something, And I thought, that's not much. That's not a very good sock puppet because it's, like it could be a bit more anonymous. And there were times when I thought it just doesn't add up, And so undoubtedly some got through, I think.
Are you able to provide any examples of kind of specific terms you were passed down to look at, or would that be too revealing?
Some of the reasons I said ventilators is because I remember that was a hot button topic at the time, and that was passed down to us. Now, where that came from, I don't know. I suspect it might have come up from one of the teams, then back down to us. But I would say the majority of the stuff that came down to us was threads that we had sent up, and then they said, pull on that a bit more. So I'd say most of the stuff came up from the teams, and but the ventilators one definitely did come back down to us, definitely did, and that was very much of interest because that was seen as a really good news story that it seemed to come from the public. The demand seemed to come from the public, obviously stoked by the newspapers, and they really wanted to get that in the newspapers that we were doing great things with procurement.
Could you briefly describe what sentiment analysis is for the general, some people understand it, but just so people generally understand what that is, what it is?
Measurement of effect is far harder to do. One of the things we do is we do sentiment analysis, which is what are your perceptions, and a very basic way of doing that on social media is what we're doing with the 77th Brigade, which is literally just reporting back what people are saying about X, Boris Johnson, the government, ventilators, and that is and this shows really the lack of sophistication of the 77th Brigade and our response to the COVID-19 response, which was we were doing very, very labour-intensive measurements of effect. We could have done things far more efficiently by using the tools at our disposal, but no one knew how to use them.
So you were pretty much just saying, this is a positive tweet, this is a negative tweet. You weren't using some of the tools that are out there that use AI to say this is anger or disgust or joy. It was pretty much positive, negative, sorted by yourself and others.
That's right, yeah. And, as you know, there are civilian products that are open source and available where you can analyse sentiment. But these weren't used, and it was very much from your perspective as an intelligence analyst. What is this person saying about X? Then maybe you would do as many as you could fit onto a slideshow presentation, which might take 10, 12, and then you'd send that off. It would get collated at a high level and then sent on to the Cabinet Office. And
so you've said that these slides would be sent to the Cabinet Office, potentially sent back for further sort of intelligence gathering on certain topics. Do you know what the Cabinet Office ended up, or if you have any idea what the Cabinet Office did with it, what they ended up doing with these kind of slides, or were you not told that? No, and very much it was at arm's length within the military. You don't step out of your lane. And if you do, you're told in no uncertain terms to stay in your lane. People build these Chinese walls, so you're not supposed to go into the other pond. There's a big fish in that pond who will gobble you up. So very much, there was no communication between our subunits and the Cabinet Office. That was very much held at an arm's length. And some would own that relationship with the Cabinet Office, and you'd have to specifically, not that we ever did, but you would have to specifically request authority to liaise directly. There's this clunky term, but they call it dialorth. It's an abbreviation, but you would never request that. It would get denied. And they say, no, you use the chain of command, and that's like classic army stuff. So anything that we sent on went directly to the team leader. The team leader would send that directly to the kind of capability leader,
And then the capability leader would send that on to not even to the cabinet office, to the liaison officer within the cabinet office, for them to show that to the cabinet office.
Yeah, so in the really great piece you've written for a report that's coming out soon, you say that basically unless someone had a real name and I am British in their bio, they were essentially fair game. Do you think sort of that kind of willingness to work in the grey was concerning, that led to a lot of domestic kind of surveillance?
It's concerning from a personal point of view, but from a professional point of view, you would have to expect someone operating a sock puppet account to at least make an effort to appear to be British. So you could say that as kind of spycraft, that they would try and blend in that respect. So I find it hard to be critical of our failure to kind of filter those people out, because you would expect to be working with people who are at least maintaining the presence of being British.
So for everything you've said, is it fair to say there is no way that with sifting Twitter you could effectively not screen British citizens as part of that work?
Yeah. I would say that's impossible. The way that we were working, it would be impossible not to also to pick up British citizens at the same time, as almost accidentally, if you like, picking up the occasional bot or sock puppet. But the way of working which we set up was so accidental that I think necessarily it was very difficult for us to pick up those foreign misinformation sock puppets or misinformation bot farms, or I think it would be very difficult to pick up those, but very easy to pick up sentiment analysis. That's the way it was being run.